What's up, everybody? It's George Gabriel, and I'm going to show you the low-budget way that you can tune your room in 4 steps. Now that we're all in an age where we can have our own home studios, we don't have to pay the tons of money it costs to actually go to a studio and record our stuff. We can do it right here at home. The problem is all of those recording studios that we went to that we paid top dollar for are designed in such a way that the sound is going to be better, hopefully, at least. And we don't necessarily know all the physics and have architects to design our studios, so we're left to our own devices to figure out where to place things in the studio. Now, the studios that I've built haven't always had the best dimensions or ceilings or the things that you would pay an architect to design a big studio for. It was low budget. I had to do what I had to do. And at the end of the day, all you really need to know is some of the basic principles to get the best kind of sound from your studio, whatever room size that is. These rules are guidelines to try to get us to make sure that we're getting an even sound where we're at. And I'm going to go over those today. So let's get started. Now, the very first thing that we're going to look at is where to place your rig in your room. Now, there's a couple of rules to follow on this. Now, we all have different sized rooms. Some of us have square rooms. Some of us have rectangle rooms. Some of you have cathedral ceilings. Some of you have low ceilings. All of those things factor in what your sound's going to be. Now, I've included below some links from various websites, but you'll note that some of these articles will contradict each other. So you have to use your best common sense judgment on where to place the rig in your room. For instance, the room I'm in right now is more or less a square-ish room. Not ideal, but if you know the dimensions of your room and you know where to place your rig, you can set up for optimal listening. So what kind of room do you have? If you have a square room, one of the things you need to know is that sound will likely bounce around in a symmetrical way, and there may be some cancellation. What your job is to do is to try to figure out where the sound's going and where to absorb the sound. If you have a rectangle room, it's best to place your rig on the short wall because that gives more time for the sound to disperse through the back of the room. If your room's a circle, there's no help for you. But seriously, really understanding the principles of how this all pans out is going to help you on where you place your rig. There's a couple trains of thought on where to place your rig as far as a wall. Again, in a rectangular room, you want to put your rig on the short wall, not the long wall. In a square room, it doesn't matter so much which wall you put it on. What matters are things like windows, what kind of surfaces there are. So if you have windows on this side or windows behind you, what you want to try to do is avoid windows at all costs. You don't want to have a window on one side and nothing on the other side. So you're going to have to figure out exactly what the best way to do it in your room is so the sound doesn't reflect unnecessarily on one side more than the other. But as far as how far to place your rig against the wall or not, generally speaking, you don't want to put it right against the wall, but you can get it pretty close to the wall. If you're too close, like less than 5 centimeters away from the wall, you may create some bass cancellation that comes into play. If you're too far away from the wall, same thing might happen because the bass waves will fall on each other and start canceling each other out. For my rig, I have mine about 10 centimeters away from the wall. And behind my monitors, I have some treatment on them to absorb some of that sound. But if you check out the guidelines and the links below, there's a couple contradictory statements, but generally speaking, if you're fairly close to the wall, but not too close to the wall, you should be okay. The other thing is you want to have your rig in the center of whatever wall it is. You don't want to have it 2 feet away from one wall and 6 feet away from another wall. Generally speaking, you want to have it centered. Other things you want to avoid is never putting something in a corner. That is a recipe for disaster. Always use the flat wall, not a corner wall. But once you've placed your rig in the right spot, the next thing to consider is where to place your monitors. Now, monitors have to follow this rule of this triangulation, and that means the distance between your monitors should be the same distance to you, the back of your head. So in other words, if my monitors are here, my sound should come here and really cross my ears. Some people think, oh, as long as I'm triangulated to my nose. No, your nose doesn't hear, your ears hear. So you want your triangulation to come to your ears. The other thing is that you don't want your monitors below your ears. If anything, you want them above your ears, and if you need to tilt them down, they need to come directly to you. Mine are a little bit higher, but they're tilted down, so they come directly to me and to my ears like this. And that ensures you're getting a good stereo image because that's how you're going to mix. Just like a microphone, if you're slightly off here or there, it does alter the sound a little bit. So that's why you want to make sure that when you look at your monitors that they're pointed to your ears, not to your nose. A subwoofer, if you have one, can kind of go anywhere. It doesn't have to be specifically right at your feet. It could be a little bit here or there because bass waves, number one, are huge, and number 2, bass is non-directional and it's monophonic. So once you have your rig on the right wall placed correctly, and you have your monitors using that notion of triangulation, where they're triangled to your ears equidistant, now you need to actually look at what materials you have on your wall, on your floor, on your ceiling. For instance, if you have a lot of windows on one side or behind you, those are hard reflective surfaces. So they'll slap back to you quite a bit. You don't want to have that. You want to squash the reflective surfaces as much as you can. Likewise, if you have windows on this side but no windows on that side, this side's going to be more reflective. Therefore, it's not going to give you an accurate representation on this side. So whatever you need to do to squash that window is what you need to do to keep it the same on both sides. If you have wood floors, that's an issue too, because wood floor is reflective. If you have a hard ceiling and a wood floor, it can create an up and down bounce. So a throw carpet might be in order to absorb some of that sound, or panels on your ceilings. Now you can see I have panels behind me, and I have bass traps in the corners as well. Corners are where bass build up, and what happens is your room has a resonant frequency, and it's really easy to figure out what that resonant frequency is by a test I'm going to show you in a little bit. But bass traps tend to eat up those bass frequencies that are lingering in the room that can give you an inaccurate mix. In fact, a lot of where our mixes fall apart is in the low end. So it's essential to have a bass trap to absorb some of that low end. For my studio, I have panels behind my monitors, I have some panels above me in the ceiling, and I have panels on the back wall as well as bass traps. I also have a door over here that has a couple of panels on it because that's a harder surface than the wall. And to keep things even, on this wall I also have a panel. Now you don't want to overtreat your room. If you put too many sound panels up, then you might get a weird phasey kind of weird sound to your room. You want to have a good balance of absorption and natural reflection. You can buy a box of Auralex panels, like 10 2x2s and some bass traps, probably for under $1,000, and that should treat your room pretty well. Might even be a little overkill. But in lack of a total budget on that, you can be creative. I've used blankets before. You can use other things that absorb sound. Basically, you want them to absorb sound and not be reflective in certain areas. Really, a good test is to do the clap test. If you clap, you can start to hear where your reflections are, and you can start squashing them. Another side note on this is I have guitars hanging up all over the place, and even on the walls over here. The thing is, those are all little reverberant devices, and so if you push your mix loud enough, all of a sudden you'll start hearing things that are coming off your wall. Now, I know it looks cool, but if you're going to try to get really precise, you might not want to have all this stuff on the wall, especially the acoustic stuff. In a prior studio of mine, I realized when I was cranking things up really loud, that room had a resonant frequency of A, and if I was loud enough, my acoustic guitars would be like, wah, in the key of A, and I was just like, oh, there you go. There's proof positive that my room has a resonant frequency of A. Sometimes they even had to remove the guitars from my room so it didn't do that. Just be aware of those things. But some panels, some carpeting, again, don't overkill. Treat your room so you have a fair amount of absorption and still some reflection, and you should be pretty well off. Now, the final step in this project's the real low budget hack. That studio I was talking about that I had a couple studios ago had that resonant frequency in A that I was dealing with. All my mixes were kind of tainted at 110, 220, 440 because of that resonant frequency. I didn't really have the budget to actually go ahead and like redesign the studio. I had to make do with what I had. So I made this little hack where you can do it yourself to know what your frequency mapping in your room is. And I'm going to show that to you now. So the first thing you need to do is get a microphone stand and a microphone that's going to be about where your ears are. Okay, so now generally speaking, what you want to do is you want to have a mic set up right about where your ears are. And you can see right behind me, I have a matched stereo pair of mics that are going to emulate my ears. Now remember, I want that triangulation point to be behind my head so it hits my ears right here. So when I'm looking at that triangulation point, I'm going to move this ahead a couple of inches, and that should be about where my ears are. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a Logic session, and I'm going to bring up the oscillator. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my tracks here. And first thing you want to do is make sure you have no output because you don't want your microphone to go back into your speakers and create a feedback loop. So make sure your tracks that you're bringing your microphone or your microphones into have no output. Then you want to go into input mode on them. And then you're going to start with your oscillator. So if I try a test tone at 20 Hertz and I have a fairly loud level on my monitors, let's see what happens. Now you can see this is what the oscillator is doing, but really what I'm looking for is what are the microphones doing. So I'm going to shut up here. And if you click these little guys here, it'll reset where you're at. Now, some microphones can't even take 20 Hertz. So these are small diaphragm condensers, so they might not even hear 20 Hertz. So let's go ahead and move this up. We'll go to 30 Hertz here. And then what I'm going to do is I'll take left and reset it and get my head out of the way. So minus 40.4 on that one, and right, reset it, minus 44. You might want to hit them a couple times just to see what they settle in at. So 43.4 on one side, 42.8 on another side. And basically what we're going to do is you're going to go incrementally up. Let's go to 40 hertz and do the same thing. Reset these, and what you're going to do is get a spreadsheet out and start notating left, right. And now you're going to start to see how the frequency response is. Now make sure your monitor level is the same, and that is going to build a frequency map of your studio. You know, another way you could do this is on each of these, you can bring up a metering plugin and just look at your level meter. It makes it a little brighter to see, and then you can see them at the same time. And if I shut up, you'll see what they do. Now let me stop it right there. You can see the difference between 90 and 100 was about 4 dB difference. That means that around 90, I have a peak. So now I'm starting to tune my room to see how the room is responding to all these frequencies. And if you go all the way up the spectrum, what you'll do is you'll get a mapping of exactly where your frequencies are high and where your frequencies are low. If you're using a spreadsheet like Excel, you can actually map out a chart on where your frequency chart is. So what happens after you sit and tune your room frequency by frequency? You put it in an Excel spreadsheet or something similar to that. And you can see what happens is I have my left here and I have my right here, and then I have the hertz up top that I've done this with. And then I made notations for every single hertz measurement that I took. And then I turned it into a graph, and that graph actually gives me a pretty good accurate representation of my room. Now my monitors are self-tuning here, but I disabled them for this experiment here. And if you look at the actual monitor readout that I had when I did tune my room to my monitors, this little area is from 100 to 300 hertz. You can see it follows the same curve, goes down, comes back up, and then dips again. I know that I'm getting an accurate representation reading of my room by doing this low budget method. So what do you do with this information at the end of the day? Well, what you do is you create a counter EQ. So when you're mixing, you know that you're hearing an accurate representation. Now my recommendation is on the lower frequencies, actually go by 5 hertz. But once you get up to like 200, then you can go by 10 hertz. And then once you get further, you can go by 20 and 30 and maybe 40 or 50 increments and just get some sort of basic EQ curve. After all, the motivation in the end of this is to create an EQ curve when you're mixing to counter your room so you can actually hear the representation in your room correctly. And then when you bounce, you take that EQ out, and that mix should translate outside of your room. So what that looks like is in your mastering chain, what you're going to do is you're going to dial up an EQ, and then that EQ, what you're going to do is you're going to try to represent this curve in reverse. Now you could bring up multiple EQs that do this, or you can do a graphic EQ if you have that kind of a plugin. But ideally what you want to do is you map the counter to this. So if I'm looking, let's say, at my center line being right here, well, I know I've got a spike from 70 to 100 hertz, then a dip at 110, and then another little spike at 120, but then it goes way down and it dips down at 180 quite a bit. So what you do is you do the opposite in the EQ. So I might take my 180 and goose that up, change my Q a little bit here, and look at the frequencies that it's picking up. And then some of these peaks, like 100, I might want to take down. And how do you decide what dB you want to do that? Well, you have all your dB readings in your chart here. So at 180 hertz, it's minus 23, minus 27. So I might want to goose that frequency up. Well, I take the other frequencies down. Now this may be an imperfect science. At least you know the frequencies in your room that are resonant frequencies. frequencies, and you can dial those frequencies out to get a more accurate representation of what your room sounds like. So it does take some nipping and tucking, but you always want to reference your mix outside of your room and see what it sounds like on different systems. And even if you just try this little trick, you might find, oh, my mixes are better because now I know my resonant frequencies in my room. Or when you're blasting something in your room and you realize you're hearing a lot of a specific frequency, you can just dial up this EQ, and what I call the EQ is my room tuning EQ. So in the end, what we've done is we've, number one, positioned our system to be in the center of the room, understanding the dimensions of our room, making sure that we're not close to windows or hard surfaces. Then we've placed our monitors using that triangulation so our monitors are hitting our ears at the right angle. Then we've treated our room using sound absorption panels to suck up some of the noise, and we've used some bass traps to suck up some of that unwanted bass. And then finally, we've created a mapping of our room using that microphone technique to understand better what the resonant frequencies in our room are. I think in the end, what you'll have is a better mix and a better sound, and you'll have a better understanding of your room. So what do you think of this video? Do you think it's crazy, or do you like what I'm putting out here? If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to be notified of future videos, and follow me on Instagram at GGabrielMusic. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you next time on George Gabriel Music.